Mr. President.
Leader is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, as expected, there's been some Democrat commentary on the process I initiated Monday, a process to restore Senate precedent and codify in Senate rules what was once understood to be standard practice, and that is the Senate acting expeditiously on presidential nominees to allow a president to get his team in place. Now, I will say that the commentary has felt somewhat muted so far, and I suspect that is because Democrats know they don't have a leg to stand on here. After years of partisanship and slowly eroding the confirmation process, they finally went all in and broke it. And they have to know that. And so it's no surprise that they aren't exactly able to mount a compelling defense of their position or a compelling attack on Republicans' move to fix the Senate. On top of that, I suspect it's even possible that some Democrats are secretly relieved that we're restoring Senate precedent. After all, I suspect Democrats would prefer not to reap what they've sowed this Congress. The prospect of blanket obstruction of every single nominee of a Democrat president can't look that attractive. Of course, the Democrat leader has made an attempt to attack Republicans' measure and defend his party's historic obstruction. And one thing he's fixated on is his claim that Democrats' historic obstruction is justified because President Trump has put forward, quote, historically bad nominees. But I'd just like to ask, Mr. President, if these nominees are as historically bad as the Democrat leader claims, why are Democrats voting for them in committee or on the Senate floor? Why have 62 of the 139 civilian nominees the Senate's confirmed so far been confirmed with Democrat support? Why are Trump nominees emerging from committee with bipartisan support? Is the Democrat leader suggesting that his own members are supporting historically bad nominees? On Monday, the Senate Judiciary Committee chairman came down to the floor and asked for unanimous consent to confirm a nominee for U.S. Attorney who was reported from committee by voice vote and who has the support of the 2 Democrat senators from his state. Is this a Democrat leader suggesting that the senior Democrat from Minnesota and the junior Democrat from Minnesota are conspiring with President Trump to put in place historically bad nominees? Mr. President, I completely respect Democrats' right to dislike some, or for that matter, many, of President Trump's nominees, and to oppose nominees that they consider to be historically bad. I've opposed more than one Democrat nominee in my time here. But let's get real here. This obstruction is not about historically bad nominees. The scores of nominees who have emerged from committee with bipartisan support are not historically bad. The U.S. Attorney candidate from Minnesota, supported by the senior Democrat senator from Minnesota and the junior Democrat senator from Minnesota, is not a historically bad nominee. And the only reason the Democrat leader objected to his confirmation by voice vote Monday, along with the confirmation of a Trump nominee who had previously been nominated by President Biden, is petty partisanship. Petty partisanship that is well on its way to turning the Senate from a legislative body into, in the words of the senior Democrat from Minnesota, and I quote, a full-time employment agency, end quote. Mr. President, before I close, I also want to mention one other complaint from the Democrat leader yesterday, and that is his claim that Republicans' attempt to restore Senate precedent on an en bloc consideration of nominees is somehow going to eliminate transparency. To hear the Democrat leader tell it, you'd think the Senate was going to start approving nominees in the dead of night behind closed doors in the Capitol basement. I didn't notice the Democrat leader objecting to a lack of transparency when we approved packages of Biden nominees, some of which probably did happen in the dark of night, albeit in the full light of the C-SPAN cameras. And of course, I should also mention that before any floor consideration, all of these nominees will have gone through the committee process, which will have provided still another forum for members to air concerns. Mr. President, the amendment to the rules Republicans are proposing is an idea with bipartisan pedigree. It would restore Senate precedent. And it would restore sanity to a confirmation process that Democrats and Republicans alike have complained is broken. Now, despite their historic blockade, I think a lot of my Democrat colleagues are well aware that we can't continue as we are. And so I say to those colleagues, many of whom I know do care about this institution, join us. Let's protect decades of Senate precedent on confirmations and get this institution fully functioning again. Mr. President, I understand that there are 2 bills at the desk due for second readings.
The leader is correct. The clerk will read the titles of the bills for the second time.
S2748, a bill to establish a program to beautify the District of Columbia and so forth and for other purposes. H.R. 4553, an act making appropriations for energy and water development and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2026 and for other purposes.
Mr. President, in order to place the bills on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 14, I would object to further proceeding en bloc.
Objection is heard, so the items will be placed on the calendar under Rule 14.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of S2296, which the clerk will report.
Counter number 115, S2296, a bill to authorize appropriations for fiscal year 2026 for military activities of the Department of Defense and so forth and for other purposes.
Mr. President, I suggest the absence of quorum.
Without objection, clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks.
Mr. President,
Democrat leader.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
First, Mr. President, it's my honor to welcome my good friend, Rabbi Dr. Ari Berman, to the Senate and thank him for offering the morning's opening prayer. Rabbi Dr. Berman is president of Yeshiva University in New York and a longtime partner in the fight against anti-Semitism. We've worked together over the years to help upgrade Yeshiva's campus to remain a world-class institution. And as we approach the Jewish New Year, a time for renewal and recommitment for Jewish families around the world, I thank him for sharing his words of wisdom. Now on foreign policy. Bad news for you, Donald Trump. The Nobel Prize is slipping away from your grasp. Crises over the last 24 hours have escalated to dangerous levels. And President Trump, you seem to be leading from behind. Donald Trump promised that he would end the war in Ukraine on day one. He said he'd put an end to the conflict between Israel and Hamas on day one. It's so easy, he said. Well, it's now day 234, and war rages around the world. In the last 24 hours, we've seen dangerous escalation on multiple fronts. Yesterday, Israel launched a strike against Hamas in the capital city of a key American ally in the middle of ceasefire negotiations. Despite being handed a ceasefire by the previous administration, 234 days later, a ceasefire deal is further off than ever. Meanwhile, hostages remain in captivity. Innocent Palestinian civilians in Gaza continue to suffer. In Europe, Vladimir Putin sent drones into Poland, a NATO ally, which required NATO military action to shoot down those drones. What was the point, President Trump, of your meeting in Alaska? We are snuggled up to Putin. And Donald Trump is hesitating now to say any strong words against Putin, even after they did this. NATO's safety has been at risk, and it's being put at risk even more so. And Donald Trump is leading from behind. The latest aggression by Putin should send a shiver down the spines of every American. I warned of this scenario as the Senate debated sending more military support to Ukraine, and I warned at that point that any division, any hesitation of our resolve against Putin would be taken by him as weakness. And I fear Donald Trump's anemic weakness against Putin and other strongmen has only pushed the world closer to the brink of chaos and even war. People don't take him seriously. People don't take Trump seriously on the world stage. That's great danger to the United States and to peace, because he bluffs and backs off. He sucks up to people, and then he doesn't do anything when they hurt him and hurt us. I warn all senators, history will not look kindly upon us if we stand back as Donald Trump acquiesces to Putin and cements himself as a Neville Chamberlain of our time. Now on tariffs and the bad Trump economy. Yesterday, the Supreme Court agreed to hear arguments on the legality of Donald Trump's tariffs as soon as next month. Legally, there is no doubt the Supreme Court should strike down Donald Trump's tariffs decisively. That's the role that the court should play, and we hope our Supreme Court justices realize that. They're not there just to serve Donald Trump. They're there to rein in the executive when the executive steps over the lines and tries to circumvent the Constitution. And tariffs are a responsibility of the Congress in the Constitution. Not only are these tariffs the definition of executive overreach, but the tariffs are wreaking havoc on the American people and businesses. The average American may not care who's responsible. They just don't like these tariffs, and they know Donald Trump is doing them. The longer these tariffs are in place, the more damage they will cause to our economy. So the court must act and apply the law which clearly states the president cannot act alone. As a result of his economic policies, it's been several days of bad economic headlines for Donald Trump, and the deluge keeps coming. Here, look at these. Look at these, folks. Look at these charts. From your coffee in the morning to your soup at dinner, your prices are going up because of Trump's tariffs. When the American people complain about higher costs for everyday things they always need and use and consume, here it is. Campbell's expects drop-off in 2026 earnings as tariff hits soup cans. The tariffs hit everything. You wouldn't think, well, soup, tomatoes, maybe they're made here in the U.S., but the cans come from aluminum. Trump's tariffs. Tariffs are hitting your morning brew. Folgers maker say prices to rise further. We don't grow coffee in the United States. There's not a competition or an unfair competition, but he raised tariffs on coffee. Everyone's paying more. My morning cup of coffee costs more. I've seen the prices rise when we shop for grounds in the supermarket. Hormel to raise prices, citing costlier pork, beef, and nuts. So again, every meal, from your coffee in the morning to your soup at lunch to your meat at dinner, your prices are going up because of Donald Trump and his tariffs. Okay. The headlines go on and on and on. And here's the sad thing, I say to my colleagues and the American people. It didn't have to happen. This is self-inflicted. This didn't happen because of the world economy. This happened because Donald Trump imposed an idiotic bunch of tariffs, unthought out, chaotic, on the American people. And he loves them. He doesn't care that your price of coffee or soup or meat goes up. Somehow he got stuck in his head that tariffs are a good thing and he's hurting average Americans. It's a self-inflicted wound, as I said. It's economic sabotage, orchestrated from the command center of dunderheads over at the Oval Office. Hardly any economist of repute knows what the heck they're doing and why. Higher costs, rampant confusion, factories slowing, all because Donald Trump's economic agenda boils down to chaos. He's like the drunk captain of a ship driving straight into an iceberg. And we, the American people, are beginning to take on water as our prices go up and up and up. On government funding. So, the clock is ticking to keep the government open. And Republicans are sleepwalking their way through another critical week. A government shutdown, once again, hangs over this chamber and this country like an ugly shadow. So what are we going to do about it? Well, it's up to our Republican colleagues to decide. They're in charge. Democrats know where we stand. We want bipartisan negotiations, input from both sides of the aisle. And we want to undo much of the damage that Trump has inflicted on the American people, particularly when it comes to health care. Leader Jeffries and I have asked Leader Thune and Speaker Johnson on multiple occasions to sit down and talk so we can have a bipartisan agreement and avoid the Republican shutdown. But we've heard nothing for weeks. The Republican silence is concerning because if they think Democrats are going to show up at the last minute to bail them out with the clock approaching zero, that would be a big mistake on their part. Democrats don't want to see a Republican shutdown. What we want is a bipartisan negotiation, bipartisan bill, where Democrats have input to tangibly undo the carnage Donald Trump has done to America. And make no mistake, the carnage Donald Trump has unleashed upon this country over the last 9 or so months is devastating. He has savaged America's democratic institutions. He has defied the rule of law, defied the order of judges, and directed Russell Vought, an evil man who came up with Project 2025, to steal or cancel congressional-approved funding. Hundreds of billions of dollars illegally blocked for things that Americans want, for cancer research, for programs that aid kids after school, for veterans, That and so much more gone, canceled, dead because of Russell Vote's whim and Donald Trump's desire to just do what he wants, what Vote wants. And of course, let's talk about health care. It is people's livelihoods. And thanks to Donald Trump, the livelihood of tens of millions is being stolen from them in broad daylight. All so Donald Trump can pay for tax breaks for the mega rich. Donald Trump's signature achievement, the one he claims is great, he calls it the big, beautiful bill. Well, this so-called big, beautiful bill, which they won't even name anymore, they're so afraid of the American people knowing what's in it, is systematic starvation of our health care system. Let me repeat that. The so-called big, beautiful bill is systematic starvation of our health care system. That's what Russell Vote has always stood for. That's what he said he'd do. And that's what Trump is aiding and abetting him to do. Republicans want to rebrand their bill. You know, they say, well, Trump said, maybe it was a mistake to call it the big, beautiful bill. That's because they know they're seeing that the American people hate it. But they can change the name. It's not going to change anything. You're not going to get your health care back because they changed the name of a bill that was so mislabeled to begin with, because it sure ain't beautiful. It's ugly. Well, maybe Donald Trump can call it the Starve and Die Act. That would be more accurate than big and beautiful. That's what happens when health insurance is taken away from you. That's what happens when SNAP is taken away. People starve, and it's estimated that people will actually die because if you can't get health care and you can't get prevention, life expectancies of people go down. And alarmingly soon, America, it's the big, beautiful bill is going to get even worse for you. In just a few weeks, unless Congress acts, millions of Americans will start getting letters in the mail telling them their health insurance costs is about to go through the roof. Hundreds of dollars, thousands in some cases. That's because the ACA premium tax credits will expire by the end of this year. People who get covered through the ACA, and there are tens of millions, will see their premiums spike by an average of 18%. There are millions, may not, depends on how you count it. Health insurance premiums going up by 18% because of Republican inaction. We tried 3 times to get them to repeal it in the so-called big, beautiful bill, and 3 times they refused. This would be a nightmare scenario for the American people. On October 1st, getting notice that your health care costs will go up 18% for millions who are on ACA. At a time of rising costs, as we have seen, at a time of a weakening job market, to then compound the injury by making you pay a lot more for health care, it's outrageous. And Republicans, again, blocked it 3 times. We've heard plenty of lip service from Leader Thune and the other side about doing something to preserve these tax credits. But now Leader Thune says Republicans will walk away from the table and sit on their hands as Americans' health insurance shoots up by 18%. Every Republican in this Senate chamber will be responsible, because all we need is a handful of them to join with us in making sure that it's extended and these costs don't go up. And this also points to a larger theme. The Republican agenda is a profoundly broken agenda. It's a stunning betrayal of the trust the American people put in Donald Trump to fight for their interests. So I want to be clear that Republicans, our Republican senators, in the face of so much damage to our country, cannot just expect the Democrats to bail them out and sign on the dotted line. What we will do is stand ready to meet Republicans and the Republican leaders face to face and negotiate a way to undo so much of Donald Trump's carnage. That means we need to have real input into undoing a lot of the carnage that's been done by this administration. It's clear Democrats don't want a shutdown, but Republicans who say they want to keep the government open have to show they're serious through their actions and not just craft a bill in the dark of night in a room and say take it or leave it, because that'll mean there'll be a Republican shutdown. They need to work and they need to show up and work with us. That's the only way to get it done and to avoid a shutdown. Mr. President, I send an amendment to the desk.
Clerk will report.
The senator from New York, Mr. Schumer, proposes an amendment to the language proposed to be stricken by amendment number 3748.
I ask consent that further reading of the amendment be dispensed with.
Amendment number
Without objection.
3849.
I have a cloture motion at the desk.
Clerk will report.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the Schumer Amendment number 3849 to 2296 to authorize appropriations, so forth, for other purposes, signed by 18 senators as follows.
I ask consent reading of the names be waived. I
Without objection.
suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks.
Mr. President,
Majority Whip.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, since President Trump took office, Democrats have weaponized the rules of the Senate. Regardless of qualification, every Trump nominee has gotten the same treatment: total obstruction, total warfare. From ambassadors to deputy assistant secretaries, Democrats have filibustered each and every one of the Republican nominations. Senate Democrats would filibuster the White House janitor if they had the opportunity. Today, President Trump is the first president in history not to have a single nominee confirmed by voice vote or unanimous consent. The actions of the Democrats is not going to change. And yesterday, the Democrats made that clear here on this floor. On this very floor, Senator Cornyn tried to bring up for consideration a Democrat's own proposal from 2023. It was offered by Senators Klobuchar and Senator King. Senator Klobuchar and Senator King wanted to confirm nominees in group. They claimed at the time that the nomination process was broken. Well, what was the status of the situation when they made that decision? They said it was broken because Joe Biden's nominees weren't being confirmed quickly enough. So let's take a look at the data. On the day that Klobuchar King was introduced in 2023, 62% of Joe Biden's nominees had been confirmed in the Senate either by voice vote or unanimous consent. 62%. Democrats said, not fast enough. So let's fast forward to today. 0%, 0% of President Trump's nominees have been confirmed by voice vote. Not a single one. So what did the Democrats do on this very floor yesterday? They objected when Republicans proposed the very similar change to what they proposed 2 years ago. They slammed the door on even debating that proposal. Senator Cornyn put forward the very reforms that the Democrats once demanded. Democrats refused to even debate them. Senator Klobuchar said in 2023 that grouping together nominees, she said, was vital for, in her words, national security, economic success, and more. Well, she was right. Yet yesterday, Democrats opposed their own proposal. You remember the words of the former Democrat senator and presidential candidate John Kerry. Said he was for it before he was against it. Democrats' hypocrisy is breathtaking. Democrats' surrender to the far left wing of their party is now complete. Democrats created today's nomination crisis. This week, Republicans began the process to return the Senate to the long-standing practices. The Senate has a history of allowing these sub-cabinet nominees to be confirmed in groups. The resolution that we have today formalizes what both parties have always done until now. Senate Republicans are building on the Klobuchar-King proposal. Republicans are simply updating it to reflect Democrats' unprecedented obstruction. Unlike the Democrats' previous version, the Republican plan is more limited. Democrats wanted to group together and confirm lifetime judicial appointments. The Republican plan doesn't include judges. Our proposal deals only with sub-cabinet nominees and sub-cabinet nominees only. Not judges, not cabinet secretaries. Those nominees will still be considered individually, many of them requiring up to 30 hours of debate. Now, modern presidents have over 1,000 positions that need to be filled, put on the job. This includes deputy secretaries, undersecretaries, assistant secretaries, deputy assistant secretaries, ambassadors, and others. Those positions keep the government running. Those nominees will now be confirmed in groups, just like they were for every president before President Trump. Every committee hearing and every markup will still happen. Every FBI background check will still occur. Every ethics review will still happen. Every nominee will still appear in front of the committees. Every nominee will still be questioned by senators, and every nominee will still be subject to a vote in the committee. In other words, scrutiny will continue. What will end is Senator Schumer's ongoing, endless obstruction. The floor here is for final action. It's not for endless obstruction. To my Senate colleagues who participated in this blockade, let me say this. You've had your chance to be reasonable. You've had a chance to work together, work with us. You have chosen obstruction instead. You demanded change at a time when 62% of Joe Biden's nominees were confirmed by voice vote. Yet you now reject the very changes you once championed now that a different president, President Trump, is getting 0 nominees confirmed by voice vote or unanimous consent. The hypocrisy is undeniable. Senate Republicans are putting back in place the very practice that Democrats had endorsed until today, the very customs that every Senate has followed until now. Senate Republicans are returning to the long-standing tradition. We are ending the Schumer confirmation shutdown, and we are getting the Senate back to work on behalf of the American people. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was listening to the majority whip, and I got to say, I have a little whiplash. I mean, I was here. I was negotiating. It was late July. We were passing paper back and forth between the Democratic and Republican caucus. The cloakrooms were working together, and we had a deal. And that's the way you get nominations confirmed in batches. The majority party wants to get them all done. Fair enough. It's their president. And the minority party has this really unique authority in this place, which is to slow things down. And the rhythm of this place is that the majority party goes to the minority party and says, what's it going to take for us to confirm a batch of these nominees? We got a backlog. We got to get some of these through. And so there are a couple of ways that that normally happens. First of all, you pair Democrats and Republicans together so that each party is getting a little bit of what they need. The problem with pairing in the Trump era, and it's different from Trump 1.0, is that President Trump hasn't even nominated Democrats to commissions like the SEC, the FTC, the FEC, the CFPB. All of those agencies usually have Democrats and Republicans nominated, and then they kind of languish on the floor until we cut a deal and we confirm them all. We had no deal space because there were no Democrats to deal out. And, by the way, many Republicans with whom I talked said, yeah, that's a fair point. Let me go and talk to the chief of staff of the president. Let me go talk to the White House team. We should get you some Democrats so that we can do some nominations in what they call the wrap-up script, right? The second thing is on the ambassadorships, usually we are able to confirm a bunch of the career State Department officials, people who work in the Foreign Service who are not political at all. And then it's the donors and the friends of the president and the kind of like, I think the whole process, frankly, of how we decide our ambassadorships is totally bananas. But both parties do this, where donors and friends of the president are the political nominees for ambassadorships. Okay? So those are the ones that we usually require a vote on. And the civil servants, the long time, some charge d'affaires for Mozambique or whatever it is, like, we're not going to fight over that, and we just confirm them. The problem is, there were like fewer than 5 career State Department people nominated to these positions, and so again, not a lot of deal space. But still, we found 35 that we were willing to do in exchange for things, and we did not ask for anything that was unreasonable in the sense of something that would be objected to by large numbers of Republicans. This was NIH funding and releasing funds for, even when we did that rescissions package, now about 6 weeks ago on the foreign aid stuff, there were a couple of categories of foreign aid that everybody said they liked. And so we just said, why don't you release the previously authorized and appropriated funding, because people are literally dying around the world. And you guys say UNICEF, PEPFAR, the World Food Program, you're still for that. You didn't like the stuff happening at USAID, but there are categories of foreign aid that you are still in favor of. So we found these relatively small, discrete things that everybody in this plate, maybe 95 of us, are in favor of in exchange for 35 nominees. Great. Looks like we've got a deal. We're trending towards a deal. Donald Trump gets on the phone with the leadership of the United States Senate and says, everybody go home. Everybody go home. And so the reason we don't have all of these nominees confirmed is the lack of the ability to conduct business in the United States Senate. And there are a lot of talented legislators, but what they have done is remove their frontal lobe and just substituted Donald Trump's judgment for their own. And so they don't want to cut deals with Democrats anymore. And that, that goes for the big, beautiful bill. That goes for their approach to appropriations. That goes to their approach for basically everything. And so it's true that we put some sand in the gears on purpose. That is what minority parties are supposed to do. That is how the United States Senate is supposed to work. And the way you untangle that is through the hard work of negotiating across the aisle, and they just didn't want to do it. Like, I have been in many bipartisan negotiations over the last 3 or 4 months, and they have mostly all failed because in the end, we can only find a handful of people who are open to a deal. And this time we had everybody saying, okay, this looks like a reasonable solution. And then Donald Trump himself blew it up. Why? Because he doesn't want expediting the Senate's consideration. He wants to adjourn. He wants this place to adjourn. Now, why is that a big deal? Adjournment sounds like something you just kind of do to like, okay, we'll see you tomorrow. No, adjournment for the month of August would have meant that Donald Trump himself would have been in a position to appoint whomever he wanted to any Senate-confirmed position. By the way, remove any member of the cabinet or subcabinet, and then appoint that person, and then that person could serve until the end of the Congress without the Senate ever weighing in. That's what he wants. And it's kind of part of a piece, isn't it? He finds the Senate to be a nuisance. And I remember this. I wasn't in the federal government executive branch, but I was in the state government executive branch. And, once you're in the executive branch, you find legislators to be annoying, to be an impediment to the kind of stuff you want to do. But the architecture of the Constitution provides that we are supposed to be annoying. We are supposed to put sand in the gears, and then we're supposed to deal with each other. And so what's going to happen this week or next with this rules change is a result of two things. It is an abject failure of the willingness to negotiate at all, of the willingness to interact with Democrats for fear of being seen as too soft and insufficiently compliant with Donald Trump. The other thing I'd just like to say is it's a little rich. It is a little rich that we fly out at 1:45 on a Thursday, and our first vote is at 5:30 on a Monday. And I know senators work hard. I'm not trying to say it's terrible that people go home. They should go home. They should interact with their constituents. But these are 2-hour nominations. We should probably exhaust the possibility of working Fridays and Mondays before we go through with changing the rules on a partisan basis. We should probably consider, do we need a 5-week homework period in the summer, or could we do a 4-week homework period and plow through nominations? And so it is true that there is a big backlog. And it is actually true that Democrats helped to create it. What is different about this year is that there's just no effort to untangle the backlog. When we were in the majority, I would walk over to Chuck's nomination staffer, figure out what was stuck, and walk over to the other side and try to make a deal every week to try to get some of these confirmations. And as I had a blanket hold on State Department nominees, not a single person approached me once. Once, Jim Risch talked to me. That's fair. But they just, I don't know if it's a muscle memory thing or if it's a Donald Trump thing, but they have simply forgotten how to work with Democrats. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Minority Whip.
Mr. President, late last week it was reported that the Pentagon was contemplating ending critical military assistance to European partners, including the Baltic states, in a program known as the Baltic Security Initiative. That's a program which I helped to create years ago to strengthen military cooperation with the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. NATO allies themselves with a long memory of Russian tyranny and still very much in Vladimir Putin's crosshairs. The Baltic states are some of the most vibrant, dedicated members of NATO, spending well above proposed funding targets for defense. The dangerous idea to cut this assistance came just as another deadline from President Trump for Russia to end its war in Ukraine came and went without any consequence. In fact, Vladimir Putin responded like he always does after President Trump sets a deadline or lavishes him with a red carpet treatment in Alaska. He brazenly increased deadly attacks on Ukraine. That's right, while we were trying to get Vladimir Putin and the Russians to finally agree to a ceasefire and end of hostilities in Ukraine, he did exactly the opposite. That's what happened over the weekend, during which Russia launched one of the biggest aerial assaults on Ukraine in the entire war, and then again did it again this week. During these attacks on Ukraine, Russian drones entered into NATO airspace, specifically into Poland. Do we take that seriously in Chicago? You bet we do, because Chicago is second only to Warsaw in the percentage of Polish residents living there, people with Polish descent. Polish President Tusk said there were 19 Russian drones in the most recent incursion. Imagine if these were manned airplanes rather than drones. 19 bombers, fighters crossing into NATO territory, several of which were shot down, including with the help of allied Dutch F-35 fighters. Now, this isn't the first time Russian drones attacked a NATO territory. There was a drone crash reported in Poland a few weeks ago as well. And Russia has been behind a campaign of sabotage, assassination, and mayhem across NATO, targeting weapons supplies, infrastructure, and dissidents. So let me say clearly to President Trump, with Putin thumbing his nose at us, violating NATO airspace, and testing American resolve, this is not the time to back away from our frontline allies. It's certainly not the time to halt bipartisan congressional support to the Baltic states. We should not be fooled. Vladimir Putin is not our friend. The Baltic states and Poland have proven that they are. Vladimir Putin responds only to strength, and right now he and other autocrats around the world are bonding together. They sense America is getting weak, and we here in Congress should not be fooled either. We should ensure the Baltic Security Initiative is included in the Defense Authorization Bill and pass the Graham-Blumenthal legislation that tightens sanctions on Russia. Mr. President, I have a separate statement I'm going to make. I'd like to unanimous consent to place in a separate part in the record.
Without objection.
On a totally different topic, Mr. President, protecting our children is one of the most important duties of public service. When families send their kids to school or let them play outside or allow them to go online, they should be confident that the kids are safe. But today, too many parents have a sinking feeling every time their kid logs onto a phone, tablet, or video game console. They know that the internet has become a dangerous opportunity for predators looking to exploit the young and vulnerable. This is not a problem of the future, it is the crisis now, and Congress must act now. In 2014, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, known as NCMEC, received approximately 1.1 million cyber tips about child sexual abuse material known as CSAM. That was in 2014. 1.1 million received tips. By 2023, less than 10 years later, the number of cyber tips had exploded from 1.1 million to 36.2 million. Over 36 million reports in a single year. Each one of these reports represents a child being harmed, exploited, or degraded. It is sickening and shows the sheer magnitude of the crisis. As I have learned more about the horrors of online child sexual exploitation, I've made it my mission in the Senate Judiciary Committee to do something about it. I'll never forget the heartbreaking testimony of witnesses, parents who came and told the story of what happened to their sons and daughters as a result of exploitation on the internet. I want to thank Senator Josh Hawley, Republican of Missouri, for being the Republican lead on this bill, and my colleagues in the Senate Judiciary Committee, Democrats and Republicans alike, who voted unanimously to advance the bill out of committee earlier this year. Let me pause for a moment and make sure you caught that word. Unanimously, every member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Democrat and Republican alike, voted for this legislation to move forward. Senator Hawley, who was in the minority at the time, voted for it. Now he's in the majority. He's the lead sponsor of my bill, which is entirely appropriate, and it's a bipartisan effort. We heard the frustration of my colleague from Hawaii about the lack of bipartisanship in the Senate. This is a notable exception. I want to recognize the extraordinary survivors and advocates who fought to make this legislation possible. Your heartbreaking stories, your testimony have made the difference. The Stop CSAM Act takes a comprehensive approach to stemming the tide of online child exploitation. Most significantly, it establishes accountability by piercing the broad immunity granted to big tech by something known as Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. The average American would flunk this quiz if you asked them what Section 230 is. The advocates who come to us to support the Stop CSAM Act know exactly what it is. It lets social media off the hook for their wrongdoing. For too long, courts have read Section 230 so broadly that it has allowed companies hosting, promoting, even profiting from CSAM to be shielded from any responsibility or accountability. That's right, they can do the wrong thing and never pay a price because of Section 230. The Stop CSAM Act changes it. It opens the courthouse doors to survivors and families. I can think of no other single thing that we could do which would be more effective. If these social media platforms can ignore parents and ignore the exploited young people and go about their business, they'll have a second thought on the subject if they face the possibility of going to court. It would allow victims to sue tech platforms and app stores that promote or aid or abet online child sexual exploitation, or that host, store, or make CSAM available. It puts teeth in the law. In addition to accountability, Stop CSAM forces transparency on big tech. For years, big tech has operated in secrecy, telling parents, policymakers, and even their own users just to trust us. But as whistleblowers and lawsuits have shown, that trust is misplaced. The Stop CSAM Act requires the largest technology companies to submit annual reports describing their efforts to combat child sexual exploitation on their platforms. Is that too much to ask? I don't think so. We've all seen the headlines. Meta's own internal research showed harm to children on Instagram and in virtual reality play spaces. AI platforms like ChatGPT, Character AI, and OpenAI are facing lawsuits for failing to prevent harmful, even deadly conversations with minors. Mr. President, this is a serious matter. The new school year has started. In some states and many school districts, they've drawn the line and told the kids, you don't bring your phones to school. You're going to be students here, you're going to talk to one another instead of texting, and you're going to look at the teacher and the board and what's before you, as opposed to your phone night in and night out. The Stop CSAM Act also includes critical protections for survivors of child sexual exploitation. The bill bolsters privacy protections for certain child victims and witnesses in federal court and gives judges the tool to enforce these protections. Altogether, these reforms hold tech companies accountable, bring transparency to their practices, strengthen law enforcement tools, and put survivors and their families at the center of our bipartisan response. The Senate Judiciary Committee has worked together on this matter, unanimously, Democrats and Republicans, to advance meaningful child safety legislation. As I said earlier, the Stop CSAM Act passed unanimously out of committee. That unanimity is no accident. It reflects a shared understanding when it comes to protecting our kids. Partisanship has no place. We've shown that Democrats and Republicans can work together to write, strengthen, and advance legislation that takes on big tech and prioritizes children's safety. To my colleagues who have not yet signed on to the bill, welcome aboard. We need you. Join us. Become a sponsor of the Stop CSAM Act. There are advocates from all over the United States who are on Capitol Hill today, knocking on the doors of Senate offices asking colleagues to take a moment, consider co-sponsoring this bill. I salute them. That is what democracy is all about, and that's what protecting our kids is all about. The Judiciary Committee has done its job. The families in our state are watching. Survivors are waiting. Advocates are working day and night to protect kids at home and worldwide. It's time for the Senate to act. Mr. President, during the course of my career in the House and the Senate, I have taken on some issues that have dealt with the security and safety of children. Years and years ago, I took on tobacco usage by kids. When I took on that particular crusade, about 25% of the kids in grade school across America were using tobacco products, cigarettes and chewing tobacco and that sort of thing. 25%. Today, that figure is below 5%. It's a lot of hard work and a lot of people stepping forward and saying, you can do what you want when it comes to adults, but for God's sake, protect our kids. Isn't that what this is all about too? Protecting our kids from the most insidious, destructive, and threatening element when it comes to their future and their safety. I encourage my colleagues, join us in this bipartisan effort. This is something we all should agree on, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President, I ask you, Mr. President.
Senator from Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that following my remarks, the senior senator from Texas, Senator Cornyn, be recognized.
Without objection.
Mr. President, the numbers do not lie. The job market is practically frozen. Unemployment is at its highest level in 4 years. Inflation is rising. Home building is stagnant. The manufacturing sector is shrinking. And to top it all off, Trump is raising the price of everything. Vegetables are up 40%. Coffee, 15%. Everything from toothpaste to detergent to shoes to video game consoles costs more. And more price hikes are on the way this fall and holiday season as businesses exhaust their inventories and give up on eating billions of dollars of added cost. This is America's golden age under Donald Trump. If it wasn't clear before, it is abundantly clear now. Unless you are a billionaire getting enormous tax cuts and generous corporate giveaways, this economy sucks. Costs are piling up, saving money is nearly impossible, and just getting by, let alone buying a home or raising a family, is a lot harder. And the worst part of it is, there was actually no reason for any of this. There's no pandemic, we're not in the middle of a war, there's no ongoing emergency. This is a crisis of the president's own making, and we're all paying the price. Donald Trump has made shortages the cornerstone of his economic agenda, and it is working. We now have shortages of nearly everything: food, electricity, healthcare, workers. And with less supply to go around, everything costs more. It does not take a genius to work that out. And in fact, people have worked it out. Trump's approval rating on inflation and the cost of living is 24 points underwater. His approval rating on the economy overall is at negative 13. More than half of Americans think the economy is getting worse, and less than a quarter of Americans think it's improving. We are on a speed run to become Venezuela, and people can see it. This is a deliberate economic program. Like, there's this sense that he just wakes up in the morning and does whatever he feels like doing, and to some extent, he is improvisational. But make no mistake, he has a coherent economic theory, which is we should shrink the supply of everything. He thinks it strengthens the dollar. He thinks it helps with manufacturing. And I think he thinks that the less there is of stuff, the more people have to go and petition the king for mercy. This is a deliberate economic program predicated on shortages across American society. And in turn, the United States is set to shrink for the first time in our history. Think about that. The United States, the greatest nation that the world has ever known, the indispensable nation, the leader of the free world, the leader of the world, is shrinking. We are becoming smaller and weaker in more ways than one under Trump. But in this way, we are quite literally following Donald Trump's plan, and there is no escaping the consequences. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, since he was sworn into office on January the 20th of this year, President Trump has done more for the cause of peace in Eastern Europe than the Biden administration did in the 3 previous years. This was evident last month when President Trump met with President Putin in Alaska to discuss peace in Ukraine. President Trump is performing an important service to the West by attempting to negotiate a brokered peace. His goal is as simple as it is profound: true and lasting peace. It's an understatement to say a lot is at stake: ending the continued suffering and loss of life, halting Putin's land grab, and restoring Ukraine's economy and territorial integrity. And while Putin has suggested that peace would ultimately equate with victory for Russia, I suggest that this war has resulted in nothing less than a strategic loss for Russia and the Russian people. There seems to be a prevailing narrative that Putin is winning and Ukraine is losing, and that the purpose of ending this war is simply to mitigate further damage to Ukraine while appeasing the aggressor, Russia. But if we consider all that's happened in the last 2.5 years, a much different picture becomes apparent. Not only has Russia failed to achieve its operational objectives, it's also suffered significant strategic setbacks that will impact that country for years to come. In February of 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine with the goal of marching to Kyiv and reestablishing Ukraine as part of Russia, restoring that part of the Soviet Union, so to speak. Putin, at first, very nearly succeeded. The Russian army came within miles of Kyiv, but then what happened? Well, to the surprise of many, including Putin, Ukraine mounted an intense resistance, and with support from its allies and partners, it turned the tide of war and reversed Russia's gains, retaking much of that territory and at times even pushing into Russian territory. Now, current estimates are that Russia holds approximately 20% of pre-war Ukraine territory, but this is a far cry from Putin's pre-war aspirations. Not only did the Ukrainians succeed in preventing a complete Russian victory, with support from the West, they've also dealt strategic blows to Russia, the effects of which will reverberate for decades. Let's consider Russia's standing as a significant military force and their ability to project power before the war as compared to today. Part of Putin's plan to invade Russia, to invade Ukraine, was to demonstrate their military might. However, more than 2 years in, we see how Ukraine has significantly degraded Russia's ability to project both power at sea and in the air. Before the war, Russia had a significant military presence on the Black Sea and freedom of movement into the Mediterranean. But through daring and ingenuity, and despite to home and limiting their ability to influence the war. All of this happened while the Russian fleet was already suffering from aging ships in need of repair, while Russian shipbuilding has not been able to keep up with repairing and replacing these old and damaged vessels. More significantly, Ukraine's successful attacks on Russian strategic bomber fleet this last June, which they carried out via Operation Spiderweb neutralized approximately 40% of 40 Russian bombers across 5 military bases, in all about a third of Russia's strategic bomber force. And more recently, Ukraine has successfully targeted Russian energy assets, which is the main source of revenue that it uses to fuel the war. Now let's consider Russia's security posture in relations to Europe. In invading Ukraine, Putin sought to counter what he characterized as NATO expansionism. Yet his actions ultimately triggered the accession of Finland and Sweden into NATO, two countries which had opted to remain outside the security alliance for decades. Consequently, not only will NATO enjoy the unique Arctic military capabilities that those countries possess, it will also benefit from extending the NATO border more than 800 miles with Russia, further stretching an already depleted Russian military. Beyond pushing NATO to expand, Putin's war in Ukraine laid bare the realities of our security relationship with NATO and highlighted what President Trump has been saying for years, that the European allies need to contribute more to their collective security. This effort seems to be paying dividends, as we most recently saw NATO member states in the 2025 Hague Summit committing to increase their annual defense and security-related spending to 5% of their GDP within the next decade. We can also see how the war in Ukraine has undermined Russian global influence and stature. We see this in places like Armenia, where Russian influence has been waning since 2022, most recently culminating in the withdrawal of a large portion of their security forces and Armenia's potential full withdrawal from the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Additionally, whereas Russia used to be the mediator of a long-standing dispute between Armenia and its neighbor, Azerbaijan, America has been able to exploit their absence, most recently by President Trump's skillfully negotiated peace agreements between those long-warring nations. This agreement will cultivate political and economic relationships, increase opportunity for American investment in the energy-rich Caucasus, and facilitate regional economic integration through the establishment of the Trump route for international peace and prosperity, all at the expense of Vladimir Putin. We also see what's happened to Russia's influence in the Middle East, and specifically Syria. In April, Germany reported that it had expelled 40 Russian intelligence officers. Similarly, France has expelled 41 likely Russian spies. Nearly half of Russia's intelligence officers, about 400 by some estimates, have been expelled from Europe since 2022. According to some officials, this may have reduced Russia's ability to collect intelligence against our allies in Europe by about half. Well, this would seem to indicate, of course, a significant setback in their operations in Europe, and one which would require time and resources and European goodwill to reestablish. But I doubt that Russia will have any of those things in the near term. But perhaps the most significant cost of this war has been the human cost. Russia has suffered immense casualties, surpassing 1 million so far. But it's become apparent that Putin doesn't care how many Russians he needs to sacrifice to his aspirations to reconstitute the Russian Empire or influence in Europe. Ukrainian casualties have been significant too, at least 400,000 since 2022, while upwards of 20,000 Ukrainian children have simply been abducted by Russia and remain missing. But the human cost of this war is far beyond the mere casualty count Russia suffered from a brain drain as high-achieving Russians have fled the country in order to avoid serving in the military. The year following the invasion, Russia had nearly 1 million young workers leave the country. Those fleeing the country are highly concentrated among the young and educated. 80% have a college education, and 86% are under the age of 45. According to one account, Russia's loss of highly skilled workers may be its most significant economic damage. Lastly, Russia has suffered severe damage to its economy as Western countries have imposed sanctions and limited their access to global markets. We've seen many European nations make efforts to wean themselves off of Russian oil and gas in order to diversify their own supplies and avoid subsidizing the Russian war effort. I'm proud of the fact that the state of Texas has helped fill much of that gap, and I'm hopeful that ongoing trade negotiations with India and the EU will further curtail Russia's ability to fund its war machine with the sale of fossil fuels. Russia's shift to a wartime economy will have lasting negative consequences for a long time into the future. It's been spending as much as 40% of its annual expenditures on defense or offense, as is obvious here, something we know from experience that is unsustainable in the long term and obviously of little benefit to the Russian people. So all things considered, Russia has suffered a significant strategic loss by their invasion of Ukraine. Apart from failing to conquer Ukraine, they've incurred enormous losses to their ability to project power and to collect human intelligence abroad. They've spurred their NATO neighbors to take their security more seriously and strengthen the alliance of which Putin has been so fearful. They've been unable to support their traditional allies in the Caucasus and the Middle East, opening up opportunities for American alliances and investment. And they've suffered tremendous human and financial costs that will endure for years beyond any forthcoming peace. As we continue to support President Trump's peace efforts in this conflict, let's keep in mind that Russia has not and is not winning this war when viewed from the larger context. Putin and his country have suffered enormous losses in many different areas. But it's clear that Putin's motivation is not driven by a sober cost-benefit analysis, but rather by delusions of grandeur and reestablishment of the Russian Empire. This past April, in his annual State of the Nation address, Putin said, and I quote, he said, "The demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century," close quote. Putin is not a pragmatist. He's not moved by cost-benefit. He's not moved by the loss of 1 million Russian casualties. The best way to bring Putin to the negotiating table with a sincere desire to end this war is by making clear that he has not and cannot win this war. We and our allies need to continue to impose greater costs in the form of additional punishing sanctions, especially on their oil production, which largely finances, as I said, the Russian war machine. Putin is not going to change his stripes, and his ambitions remain unchecked. The surest way of ending the war and securing a lasting peace will be a united West showing Putin that he cannot win. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Hawaii.
I sent an amendment to amendment number 3849 to the desk.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Hawaii, Mr. Schatz, proposes an amendment number 3854 to amendment number 3849.
I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
President Pro Tem.
I ask that the calling of the quorum be off.
Is there objection?
Yeah.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we all have a responsibility to understand the history of our country. We have a responsibility to learn from that history. And we learn from that history so we don't repeat the failures of the past. So I'm here to remind my colleagues of some of that history, but also able to fill in some details that are just recently made public as a result of some of our investigative work and the cooperation we've had from the intelligence community and from the FBI. Today, I visit with my colleagues to discuss two dates of significant importance. January 6, 2021, and January 6, 2017. And most of my remarks are about that date in 2017. Regarding the 2021 date, it was a dark day in American history. The violence against our Capitol and law enforcement was, as we all know, a great national disgrace. First Amendment activity turned into something else. The latter date, January 6, 2017, is a date many in this country may not remember or care to remember, but I think it's important that we remember it. It's a day that signifies a much larger systemic attack on our republic. On that date, as the Obama administration planned its exit from its presidency of 8 years, it put into motion its final traps against the incoming first Trump administration. To fully understand January 2017, we must revisit March and July 2016. But one could argue that it all started June 16th, 2015, when Trump declared his candidacy. Around March or July of 2016, the FBI received particular intelligence information. Notably, July 2016 is the very same month that FBI Director Comey opened the discredited Crossfire Hurricane investigation. That intelligence information consisted of reports that the Clinton campaign, with Hillary Clinton's approval, created a plan to falsely tie Trump to Russia. That information was made public this year when I released the Durham Annex and the Clinton Annex. The Clinton Annex showed the FBI had evidence necessary to do a complete investigation into Hillary Clinton, and the FBI failed to look at it, at that very evidence, and perhaps they intentionally decided not to follow up. So the FBI swept the evidence against Clinton under the rug as they planned to advance the crossfire hurricane against Trump. Regarding the intelligence about the Clinton campaign's plan to falsely tie Trump to Russia, the Durham Annex notes that, quote, FBI was fully alerted to the possibility that at least some of the information it received about the Trump campaign might have its origin either with the Clinton campaign or its supporters, or alternately was the product of Russian disinformation, end of quote. The Durham Annex concludes in part that, quote, despite this awareness, the FBI appears to have dismissed the intelligence information as not credible without any investigative steps actually having been taken to either corroborate or disprove the allegations. In other words, the FBI didn't do what the FBI should do, and that is follow up on the facts. So just as the Clinton Annex, where Comey's FBI didn't investigate evidence that might have been bad for Clinton, the Durham Annex shows Comey, FBI, didn't investigate intelligence that the Clinton team wanted to falsely tie to Russia to destroy his candidacy in favor of her candidacy. I refer to the Durham and the Clinton annexes because they were just recently declassified, so this information is available. So folks, that is what I just described as a cover-up. So the question, what was the main purpose of the cover-up? The answer, weaponize the federal government to destroy Trump's candidacy and presidency to favor Clinton. You see, Clinton, to the people in this town, was not a threat to the status quo, and they saw Trump as that threat. In August 2016, President Obama and Vice President Biden met with 3 high-level people, or probably more than 3, but the 3 that I name are CIA Director Brennan, Director of National Intelligence Clapper, and FBI Director Comey. They discussed the intelligence relating to the Clinton plan. They were aware of the possibility that the Clinton campaign had dirty tricks up their sleeve designed to impact the election. Question, let me ask, so did that stop the Obama administration's effort against Trump? Well, we know now that it did not. Then on December the 9th, 2016, so this is after Trump had been elected, President Obama's national security team gathered. That meeting included Director of National Intelligence Clapper, CIA Director Brennan, FBI Deputy Director McCabe, National Security Advisor Susan Rice, Secretary of State Kerry, Attorney General Lynch, and others. After that meeting, Clapper's office transmitted an email to the intelligence community leaders titled, quote, President of the United States tasking on Russia election meddling, end of quote. Clapper asked his personnel to create an, quote, assessment per the president's request, end of quote. The new assessment was an intelligence community assessment. Per the good investigative work of the House Intelligence Committee's report, quote, unlike routine intelligence community analysis, the intelligence community assessment was a high-profile product ordered by the president, directed by senior intelligence community heads, and created by just 5 analysts using one principal director. Production of the intelligence community assessment was subject to unusual directive from the president and senior political appointees, and particularly the director of the CIA, end of quote, from that House Intelligence Committee report. Again, a question. Why go through all this effort to create a new product? Well, according to the good work of Tulsi Gabbard in the House Intelligence Committee, CIA officials didn't have credible and verified information showing Putin wanted to get Trump elected. And the intelligence at the time showed that Putin withheld information that would have been damaging to Clinton and therefore would have helped Trump. Obviously, these fixers would not do anything to hurt Clinton. So the Obama administration needed their fixers. On December 22, 2016, National Security Agency Director emailed Brennan, Clapper, and Comey. That email noted that the National Security Agency didn't have enough time to review the intelligence for purposes of the new intelligence community assessment Obama ordered. So they wanted to get it done very, very quickly. So this is how Clapper responded to the National Security Agency. Quote, we may have to compromise our normal modalities, end of quote, and that, quote, more time is not negotiable. And this is one project, continuing to quote, this is one project that has to be team sport. In other words, we need this very quickly. Don't go through the normal process. You see here, the deep state wanted a new intelligence product created from the top down, not from the bottom up, as is usually done, and they wanted it done so badly that they were willing to cut corners, even if it put the country into chaos. What was this new product? It was the December 30th, 2016 Intelligence Community Assessment tying Trump to Putin. It stated in part, quote, we assess Putin and the Russian government aspired to help President-elect Trump's election chances when possible by discrediting Secretary Clinton and publicly contrasting her unfavorably to him meeting Trump, end of quote. In their partisan Reich, and it was a Reich, that intelligence product was published on the date that I previously referred to, that is a date ought to be remembered, January 6, 2017. That same day, then, Director of the FBI, Comey, briefed President-elect Trump on the discredited Clinton campaign funded that we call that famous Steele dossier. The new intelligence assessment said Putin favored Trump over Hillary Clinton, even though earlier intelligence had shown Russia simply wanted to cause political chaos in the United States, and it didn't matter whether that president was a Clinton or a Trump. The new intelligence assessment is exactly what the Durham Annex and the Clinton campaign wanted to accomplish. The Durham Annex also noted existing intelligence products, said the Clinton campaign believed elements of the Obama administration would help them achieve their political ends against Trump. Based on the available evidence, there is no doubt the new intelligence assessment was a political hit job that had been ordered by President Obama. And let me remind folks that Senator Johnson and I got Annex A to the new intelligence assessment declassified way back in 2020. Annex A was a summary of discredited Steele dossier. Comey and Brennan worked hard to make sure it was included, even though it was unverified and didn't meet the standard for inclusion. Now, how convenient do you see that is for them? Now, this next part is very important. In 2020, Senator Johnson and I publicly released additional information that we'd been able to get declassified. That declassified information showed that the Russians knew of the Steele dossier at least as early as July 2016 and before the FBI began Crossfire Hurricane. The declassified information also stated that the FBI received information that an individual, quote, central in connecting Trump to Russia, end of quote, was very likely a Russian intelligence officer. The declassified information also showed that the FBI received an intelligence report on January 12, 2017, warning of false information in the dossier and that the material was, quote, part of Russian disinformation campaign to denigrate U.S. foreign relations, end of quote. On the very same day, January 12, 2017, the FISA warrant on Carter Page, which used the discredited dossier, was renewed for the first time. The Steele dossier served as a gift to the Russians, a vehicle to pack false information in the hopes the Obama administration and Comey would fall for it, hook, line, and sinker. Or Obama and his minions saw the obvious and proceeded anyway, believing nobody would ever get all this information declassified for public to see. In any event, with all these red lights flashing, stop, the Obama administration went full speed ahead. And even with Trump as president, Comey gleefully ran every stop sign. The Comey FBI still used the discredited Steele dossier to get a FISA warrant and multiple renewals on Carter Page. And the political hit job continued with the Mueller special counsel investigation. Now, with the public having seen all this declassified information kept in the dark for all of 10 years, there's no doubt that Mueller investigation or review was totally unnecessary. As this continued to evolve, the Mueller fiasco was just the deep state trying to get another hit job on Trump. Then, the Biden administration entered the office to consider the partisan political dirty work. For example, Senator Johnson and I released records relating to Arctic frost. That's the FBI case that anti-Trump special agent Thibault created with the help of partisan FBI agents and Department of Justice prosecutors. Based on emails that I've obtained from whistleblowers, we know Thibault opened and even approved the case in violation of the FBI rules. According to Deputy Attorney General Blanche, as defense counsel for Trump, Jack Smith and his team withheld these emails from the Trump defense team. Arctic frost conveniently became one of Jack Smith's cases against Trump, and it was politically infected from the very start. Based on more emails whistleblowers have given me, we also know that Thibault, supervisory agent, Special Agent Blair Tolman, Special Agent Walter Giagardina, and partisan DOJ prosecutors focused their efforts and resources on Peter Navarro. When Department of Justice prosecutors under Merrick Garland authority decided to prosecute Navarro, Thibault said, quote unquote, "Wow, great," end of quote. You see how determined these people were to do anything underhanded to get Trump. From the time then candidate Trump came down the escalator in 2015 to this very day, it's been a decade of political weaponization of law enforcement and intelligence community activities. The examples I've given today are that, examples. I could speak for days on end about my investigative work, what it's uncovered over the years, and the fact that political bias has so deeply infected this country's law enforcement and intelligence community agencies. What that's all added up to, it ought to shake everyone in this country to their very core. If the government, including the Department of Justice so-called Public Integrity Unit and an elite FBI public corruption squad, can do that to the President of the United States, just imagine what the government can do to you, the very citizens of this country, if it decides to give you its full and undivided attention. January 6, 2021 was a single day, a day that we shouldn't forget. January 6, 2017 was a day that was meant to topple a presidency. And it should certainly outweigh January 6, where a ragtag mob stormed the Capitol with zero chances of succeeding. To be intellectually honest and fair, we can't ignore the decade of weaponization by taxpayer-funded law enforcement and intelligence community agencies against Republicans, not just the president. What's so disgusting about Obama and Biden administration's partisan conduct that I've just told you about is that its personnel didn't care about the long-lasting damage to this great nation, including eroding trust in American institutions. And the partisan media went right along, no questions asked. And those journalists in this town and around the country are supposed to be policing the political system to make sure that everything is above board. And they didn't do it in this case, and they aren't doing it today either. In this case, no questions were asked. This behavior is an existential threat to our republic because it creates a systemic, insidious infection that grows in the dark, behind classified walls and bureaucratic red tape, far away from the eyes of the American public and the Congress. And all this behavior was paid for by the taxpayers of this country. I'm thankful to Attorney General Bondi, Director Patel, Director Gabbard, and Director Ratcliffe for their aggressive transparency efforts. Making all these classified documents public may prevent further dangerous conspiracies as these are from reoccurring again. For my part, and for we the people, my investigative work will continue to shine light on those very dark corners of government. Because, as I said when I opened my remarks, you have to know about the history of the country to appreciate what we enjoy today. And if you don't learn from the mistakes of the past, they're going to be repeated. So I have come to the Senate floor to tell my people what has been unveiled today that was previously classified, and going through the entire story so this country doesn't make the mistake again of letting all the powerful forces of the American government, the FBI, the intelligence community, people that operate behind closed doors, that political strength and weaponization never continues again. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we are 9 months into the second Trump administration, and there are two dynamics that have become very painfully clear. One is the arbitrary use and abuse of power by the executive, and two, the regrettable passivity of the United States Senate. It's a dangerous combination. An executive who is doing much more than he has the legal power to do, and a United States Senate not doing what it is constitutionally required to do. The two very explicit examples of executive overreach are tariffs and budgets. The United States Constitution, as you know, Mr. President, granted the Congress exclusive authority over setting tariffs under Article 1, Section 8. And that's because that is the taxing power that belongs to the Congress. And the point of Congress having that obligation is that we are answerable in the House every 2 years, in the Senate every 6 years, to the constituents who elect us. And the power to tax is the power to kill. And we have to exercise our responsibility on the taxing authority vested in this body by the Constitution. Yet the executive is imposing tariffs using as a pretext emergency authorities that under special legislation assumed restraint in the executive. We have seen this in case after case after case. Tariffs that are imposed on the personal decision of one person, an individual, the executive. And they can be for economic reasons, they can be for personal reasons, they can be for political reasons. It's not a policy. It's an erratic imposition of tariffs on our trading partners. In some cases, Canada, under the theory or argument that it's a, quote, national emergency, when there is no threat to our national security by Canada. They're our near and dear friends. Or it's on a personal reason, because the president does not like what the Brazil Congress is doing with respect to its former president. And suddenly there's a 50% tariff that is imposed. This is a tax, and as a tax, it is our obligation to be the ones that decide if, when, whether, and how a tariff will be imposed. This should not be something that we look the other way when the executive takes that constitutional responsibility that only we have. The second area of executive overreach is in the budget. The power of the purse, that belongs to the Congress of the United States. Again, our framers saw that the Congress would be the closest to the people that we represent. We would be the ones who would be making decisions about meeting their needs through the taxing and spending power vested in us. But what we now have is a situation where budgets that have been passed on a bipartisan basis by this Congress are being changed or ignored by the executive. We've seen this year a rolling rescission and a rolling shutdown, where funds that were appropriated by Congress are not being spent by the executive, with no explanation other than he has the power to not write the check. That is not how the Congress and the executive are supposed to work. Congress sets the budget, we're the appropriators, and then the president implements that. Right now, there's $410 billion in funds that have been frozen by the Trump administration. And it's funds that are really important to our communities, that bipartisan votes authorized. $3.8 billion, for instance, to support local police, victims of crime, and other criminal justice programs. $1.5 billion to help U.S. farmers, to help feed hungry people around the world through the Food for Peace program. $220 million in funding to create regional tech hubs to strengthen the U.S. economic and national security. These are future-looking investments to bolster our higher education system and critical manufacturing supply. $109 million to support new and beginning farmers, veterans, and farmers historically left behind. $91 million to help improve weather forecasting, and the list goes on. But the point here is that we, as a Congress, have the authority and the responsibility to set the budget. We did it. It was signed by the president, and now he's disregarding what the law requires him to do. So you've got an executive that is seizing the taxing power of Congress, and you've got an executive that is assuming unconstitutionally the spending power of Congress. Now, why is it important that Congress resist this? It's important because our founding document rested on the wisdom that there should not be a concentration of power in one branch of government. Not the judiciary, not the Congress, and not the executive. In the separation of powers, with three co-equal branches of government, all hinged on the expectation that each branch would use the powers jealously that it was authorized to have under the Constitution and not cede those to another branch. That's an obligation that we have to the Constitution, that we have as a Republican or as a Democrat to the Constitution. And there's wisdom in that, because as we're seeing the power of Congress being seized by the executive with our assent, with us turning away as though it's not happening, we are failing to maintain that system of checks and balances that has served our country so well for so long. You know, I have a lot of objections to many of the Trump policies, but there are many here who support the Trump policies, and that's the point. It's our job to debate, and then whoever gets the votes, that policy will prevail. But whatever differences we have about policy, we have a shared responsibility to meet our constitutional obligations, to be the branch of government that takes responsibility for whatever taxes are imposed on our citizens. That's our job. And we don't do it when we cede that authority to the executive. It's also our job under the Constitution to provide for the appropriations that taxes pay for. Those are our decisions. And every single year we have debates about what are the best priorities, how to allocate the spending, what level of spending we should have. But once we make that decision, it's the limited authority of the executive to then implement the decisions we've made. Instead, what this Congress is now doing is passing a budget only to see the Office of Management and Budget on behalf of the executive saying, you know what, I don't care what you appropriated. I don't care if it was bipartisan. We'll do what we want. We'll spend what we want, or we won't. That is a complete abdication of responsibility by this Congress, and it is very dangerous. It's dangerous because with the taxing authority being made on the personal decisions of the executive, you don't have a policy that anyone can count on. It's going to be damaging, and already is, to our economy. If we have passed budgets and then look the other way, when the executive decides he is not going to spend it, or spend it in the ways that we directed, it means that we have no capacity to meet the needs as we see them of our farmers, of our children, of our educational challenges. Mr. President, this dynamic of executive overreach and U.S. Senate passivity has got to end to protect the well-being of our democracy and the well-being of the people of the United States of America. I yield back.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, Tremonton, Utah is a quiet town in the Bear River Valley, known for, among other things, the Box Elder County Fair, now celebrating its 100th year. It's the kind of place where folks wave as they walk past, where neighbors look out for each other, and where life feels far from the noise and the chaos of other parts of the country. But on Sunday, August 17th, that peace was shattered. Sergeant Lee Sorensen and Officer Eric Estrada, two devoted public servants, responded to a domestic disturbance call. In the line of duty, both were shot and killed while protecting their community. Their loss has left a hole not just in the families, but in Tremonton and across Utah. Earlier today, we laid a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier in their honor. It was a humbling reminder that sacrifice, whether on foreign battlefields or the quiet streets of our towns, is what preserves our freedom. We all know policing is never easy. Officers step into the unknown often with seconds or less to decide between life and death. Domestic calls are among the most dangerous. That night in Tremonton, Lee and Eric faced lethal fire, yet their courage saved lives. A deputy with his canine were injured but survived. Others made it home because Lee and Eric did not. Sergeant Sorensen, a 16-year veteran, was known as steady and kind. He checked on grieving neighbors, looked out for late-night grocery store employees, and every year rode his bike in the county fair parade, tossing candy with a smile. Officer Estrada, just 31, was a husband and a father, known for his humor and compassion and for putting people at ease. Together, these men embodied the best of Utah law enforcement, service rooted in responsibility. To give you perspective, the Tremonton Garland Police Department has just 17 people. officers, and staff together. They didn't get to stop and grieve. They had to carry on, leaning on each other and on a community that has shown incredible kindness. At their funeral, thousands lined the streets in the rain. Blue ribbons appeared on homes and storefronts, and money was raised for their family. That is Utah at its best. Neighbors locking arms and lifting one another. Mr. President, Utah has always honored sacrifice. My pioneer ancestors climbed Ensign Peak in 1847. They looked out over a barren desert and imagined what could be. A thriving home built on faith, family, and community. They didn't have much, but they had courage. They knew the future would demand hardship and unity. Sergeant Sorensen and Officer Estrada carried that same pioneer spirit. They stood watch so others could rest. They chose duty over comfort. They walked into danger so others could walk in peace. President Kennedy famously said, "Ask not what you can do for your country. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." Lee and Eric lived that creed. And as President Ronald Reagan reminded us, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. On that quiet street of Tremonton, they stood against that extinction. Deputy Allred, who was shot and survived, said while recovering, "If I could ask one thing to come from this senseless tragedy, it's this: don't forget how much love and support is being handed out right now. Communities are coming together. Kindness and love are being shared. Keep this moving forward and don't stop ever." That's the charge before us. Our mission is to ensure Lee and Eric are remembered not as headlines, but as symbols of Utah values and American courage. And our commitment should be to work for solutions to better support our law enforcement, strengthen protections for families and individuals, and bring peace to mind to our hardworking citizens. So let us pledge today, Sergeant Sorensen and Officer Estrada will not be forgotten. Their service, their laughter, their sacrifice live on in us. May we honor them not only with our words, but with action worthy of their examples. Thank you, Mr. President.